I think, points out something. That what the function of our portrayals of Soviet society has been is to be kind of like an inverted mirror image of our own problems. As the U.S. economy in the 70s sank deeper into stagflation, stories began to appear about worsening economic conditions endured by the Soviets. The message was, no matter how bad we have it, they have it even worse. In fact, Jack Anderson said that in his column. We may have it bad, but they have it even worse. And it was a column on inflation. As inflation reached double-digit levels in the U.S., stories about inflation in the Soviet Union began to appear in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report. A closer reading of these inflation stories, which the average reader doesn't give, but if you're writing a book on the media, you give them a closer reading, as I did, revealed to me that, and you'd have to get down to paragraph 13 or 14, that basic necessities in the Soviet Union, such as food, rent, transportation, medical care, and education, were strictly price-controlled and subsidized by the state and had not at all been subject to any kind of inflation. What was the inflation? Generally, it was on luxury articles like automobiles, caviar, vodka, expensive clothes, and things of that sort. In September '81, the New York Daily News ran a story, headline, "Soviet Prices Soaring." That was the headline, with a subheading that read, "Gas, booze, cost comrades a pretty kopeck." Love that. Hey, I love that kind of journalism. That's what you call your upbeat. Only in the last two paragraphs of that report do we discover that prices were actually lowered or held steady on most essentials, including food. The price of bread in the Soviet Union has not changed since 1928. The price of riding on the subway in the Soviet Union in Moscow is still 7 cents or 5 kopecks. And it's quite a ride if you ever go to the USSR. I took it, except I was too terrorized I couldn't read the signs. One, they learned to write. What was that? Steve Martin said on his trip to Paris, he said, "We go all the way to Paris. You'd think they'd have the decency to speak English to us." We still hear, by the way, stories about the troubled Soviet economy. The Washington Post writes that the Soviets are suffering, quote, "production difficulties in the oil industry, and the Kremlin is trying to prepare the population for a period of uncertainty and difficulties." In fact, heavy industry production in the Soviet Union has been doing well. Production growth is no longer going 11, 12%. It's down to more like 4 or 5%. But you see, there's another remarkable thing. Last year, that economic recovery we had in this country was a remarkable economic recovery, because I picked up the New York Times financial page and it said 1% growth. Recovery slow. I said, I'll say slow. 1% growth is recession. 1% growth is a slow, and it said, but steady and hopeful recovery. So when the U.S. economy has a 1% growth, that's a slow but steady recovery. When the Soviet economy drops from 9 and 10% down to 4%, this is called a crash and a failure of the economy. Again, you see, the facts do not really speak for themselves. It depends on how they are framed. Wages of Soviet miners and payment to pensioners were recently increased. Wages in general have climbed 41%, real wages, since 1970, along with benefits for maternity leave, aid to large families. None of the media have seen fit to publicize these facts. Likewise, none of the news media has publicized the fact that every Soviet citizen is guaranteed a right to a job, and there's no unemployment to speak of, that every Soviet citizen has the right to change his or her job, that Soviet men can retire at the age of 60, and Soviet women at the age of 55. In fact, they do retire. They're required to retire. You then receive a pension, and you are then allowed to get another job if you so want. You don't have to. That you talk to the average Soviet citizen, unlike the average American citizen, and including including people in fairly affluent incomes, they're not sitting there in fear of, will I be able to maintain myself in my old age? If you want to know what's on the mind of many Americans, not just blue-collar workers, I'm talking about friends of mine, a woman I know is in realty who makes $70,000 a year, a friend of mine who's a shrink who makes $100,000 a year. You know what's on their mind? What's going to happen to me when I retire? What's going to happen to me when this income ends? Will I be able to maintain my standard of living? Will I still be able to go out to a restaurant and have a vacation now and then? Will I end up in that furnished room with the naked electric bulb over me? It's an image that haunts people as they get up there in years. As they said, middle age is when thoughts of passion turn to thoughts of pension. Well, in socialist societies, I talked to my friend Otto Jorg from the German Democratic Republic, GDR, and I said, do people in your country and do you fear a retirement the way people here do? You worry about will you be able to maintain yourself? He said, no, not at all. He's by the way, head of the GDR News Bureau in Washington and covers news and works awfully hard. He said, I'm looking forward to retirement. He said, quite the opposite. You envy them. You walk by and you see people sitting around and they're smiling and laughing, and they've retired, and you've got to go off to work. You envy them, and there isn't that kind of one of the essence of capitalist society is insecurity. The essence of capitalist society is that you must keep going after that wage. If you don't keep going after that wage, then there's no exploitation of the wage earner. And so one is never really secure here unless one has very substantial wealth. And even then you worry that there may be revolutions that will come and take that wealth away from you. No joke, the governor of New York State some years ago sent in the state troopers in Attica, you remember? And the state troopers went in there and massacred. It was called the biggest massacre of Americans by Americans since Wounded Knee, 1890. And they went in there, and when they turned to Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and they said, why did you do it that way? Why did you send those troopers in with blazing guns killing these guys? The prisoners had rebelled and they taken hostages. But the prisoners had a few skivs and a few clubs, and that was it. They weren't really armed. And the guys went in there killing. They even killed some of their own guards, 7 or 8 of their own guards, because they went shooting so wild. And Rockefeller's answer was, they were revolutionaries. They were preaching a doctrine of revolution, and who knows where that could lead? The governor of New York. And who has more to fear from a revolution than a Rockefeller? So it's a very real thing even for the most wealthy, the specter of revolution. The American public was not told that every Soviet citizen has a right to free education to the highest level of her or his ability, that they have free medical care, which is something U.S. citizens do not have. There's still about an estimated 40 million Americans who have no medical coverage of any kind, and millions of others who think they have comprehensive coverage, who, when hit with a serious illness, find that they go bankrupt anyway. These are tough things to hear. I mean, this flies right in the face of everything that we have been taught.